Prior to contact in Canada, education was strong. The community was the classroom and the family was the teachers. Through modeling, they taught right from wrong. Children learned traditional languages and ways through the love of their parents and the wisdom of their elders, growing stronger with each passing day. But then one day, colonizers came along, and life as it was suddenly changed. Believing traditional ways to be savage, they claimed Aboriginal peoples did not belong. They attempted to destroy the peoples and culture through policies of assimilation, outlawing language and ceremony, and forcing traditional family structures to rupture. In 1763 came the Royal Proclamation. Canada spread Western treaties and government took responsibility of children in a desperate attempt to strengthen the nation. Next came the Indian Act in 1876 and the daunting sections that followed, removing the rights of Aboriginal parents, giving the government the power to continue its tricks. Following this came the plan to tear families apart, assimilate. As Sir Duncan Campbell Scott stated, the goal was to kill the Indian and the child. Their answer for this was the industrial school template. Through forming partnerships with various Canadian churches, Anglican, United, Catholic, and Presbyterian, the government unraveled their scheme and created residential schools from high up on their perches. In the year of 1884, an amendment was passed, making residential school mandatory, and so it began that Aboriginal children ages 7 to 15 were amassed. These schools were run mainly by nuns and priests who were strict and unforgiving. Many children were abused, and the use of traditional languages and ways ceased. Children were punished for speaking anything but English, told their families and ways were savage, were punished, coerced, and manipulated until their self-identities could no longer be distinguished. Residential school continued for many decades in Canada, through numerous unsuccessful phases. From assimilation to segregation to integration, children used as pawns in the government's agenda. Gradually, the federal residential schools began closing, the last one being in Saskatchewan in the year 1996, along with apologies from the churches that were folding. An apology also eventually came from the government, made by Stephen Harper, who said that he was sorry for the sad chapter in history, but with disingenuous intent. Merely 1 year following the apology, Dear Mr. Harper boldly stated at the G20 summit, Canada has no history of colonization, denying our true past and forgetting his recent historical marker. And now Aboriginal peoples are left to heal from residential schooling, which provided a lack of education and created intergenerational trauma in a country where Aboriginal and Western worldviews are dueling. This requires a return to tradition and will not happen fast, as healing is an ongoing journey, but despite centuries of cultural genocide, many traditional language and ways have managed to last. In this feat, we can see the true strength and resilience of Aboriginal peoples and cultures, and surely the future will hold a legacy of strong education, self-determination, and brilliance.
Well, I think the biggest difference that I've heard, I guess, listening to my parents, is that a lot of our children were educated by family. It was by their uncles, their aunties, and the grandparents. And compared to now that many of our children aren't educated by their family now, where they go to a school system. And of course, things are always told orally. Nothing was ever written down. So many of the teachings were told through storytelling. The landmarks that we have around the different area around the valley here, there are stories behind all the different places that we go, whether it's of an island or a rock or a piece of land. And the land that it's named, and the name of a land tells the story in itself about all of the land. And so a lot of those things are but I see that's one of the biggest differences. And I remember a number of years ago, an elder took us up to Mount Zuhalem, and we just sat down. This is our school, and I always remember that. And that's how our people taught our kids, is through nature, and through the animals, and gathering, harvesting of food, and everything was taught outside. And so I guess there's that big contrast where, kids are taught outside in nature in comparison going into a classroom setting where there's four walls and they're staying inside all day. So that in itself is a big transition. And so I always believe that gotta take kids outside and teach. You can't always just keep them indoors all the time and expect them to listen all day and be indoors. And when I first started boys groups at the school systems a number of years ago, I always continually asked to take the boys out of the classroom and outside in nature, and to do the talking circles, to do fishing, to look at medicines, go for walks. And you learn a lot just from walking and talking to the kids. All the different things come up. So I still believe that's one way that's been the big change in our education system. The kids is teaching the kids through nature. And one of the, I don't know if this teaching is followed as much today as back in our grandparents' time, was that usually the first grandchild in each family was brought to the grandparents to raise, so the grandparents would teach the grandchild a lot of the teachings of the family. So a lot of the teachings are carried on. So that was another important way that our elders taught young people, was the first grandchild going, living with and being raised by the grandfather and grandmother. And so that was a big part of teaching, keeping the values in each of the families going. And my mother always talks about, when she was raising children, that all the uncles would always go and visit. They always had something to teach our parents about raising children and educating their children. And whenever the aunties came up, each one of them had something to teach. And so it really was a family raising a child. And I think a big part of that is not being followed as much, where the children are either being raised by just the two parents, or a lot of times a child is being raised by the school teachers. Sometimes after school, kids go to daycare because of two parents being working now, because of the cost of living in our country now. It's needing that money to just to pay for things like rent and food, and so that's a big difference that I see in how our children are being educated now.
Europeans had started to make their mark in Aboriginal culture and teachings when they felt the need to educate Aboriginal children in Christian belief systems. Europeans did not do well in child-rearing ways. Their discipline was hurtful and demoralizing. Children in Europe as young as 6 years old were forced into labor such as chimney sweepers, miners, factory workers, prostitutes, and beggars. Victor Hugo wrote a play, Les Miserables, which describes the way children were treated in France. In 1620, the Franciscan monks opened up boarding schools to attempt to Christianize Aboriginal children. Decades later, the Jesuits and Ursulines followed suit. European values and beliefs in educating children started to change the way Aboriginal people would educate their children. With the overwhelming amount of European settlers, Aboriginal people's values and beliefs became devalued and looked upon as pagan ways. The government created a royal proclamation in 1763 to govern the affairs of the Indian people. Here was another change that had an effect on teaching Aboriginal children. Aboriginal people then became wards of the state, and how they parented, educated, and lived their lives forever would be changed. The influence of European beliefs on childrearing was putting enormous amounts of pressure on Aboriginal ways of life. In 1847, the Chief Superintendent of Education in Upper Canada indicated in a report to the Legislative Assembly that education must consist not merely of the training of the mind, but of a weaning from the habits and feelings of their ancestors and the acquirements of the language, arts, and customs of civilized life. Throughout history, during meetings between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, some Aboriginal leaders requested education for their communities. They wanted to understand and integrate the aspects of Western culture they felt were important. Regrettably, they could not have foreseen the eventual outcome. In 1884, when the potlatch was banned, Aboriginal education took another blow to ways of teaching through ceremony. Without ceremony, handing down knowledge to children would be made difficult. Between 1886 and 1887, it was decreed that Aboriginal children must attend schools. Residential school and boarding schools were created. The government funded the schools and the churches ran the schools. Children were raised and taught by priests and nuns who did not have any children of their own. They were strict and mistreated the Aboriginal children. Their focus was to kill the Indian in the child by taking away everything they knew and making them follow the Christian way. Children spent most of their time praying and doing chores and little time on education. Children were taken away from their parents, were not allowed to speak their language, and were punished if they did. Living in a foreign place, not allowed to talk or hug their brothers or sisters, Aboriginal children were traumatized by what they experienced in residential schools. Lack of parenting skills, cultural teachings, education, and lack of self-worth has caused Aboriginal children to hand down their traumatic experiences to the future generations. The state felt that the education given to Aboriginal children was less important than killing the Indian in the child. It was not about giving Aboriginal children an opportunity to succeed in society. The last residential school was closed in 1996. It was Gordon Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan.
When you asked me to talk about Chinoy, I had some time to think about it, and a lot of things coming to the whole picture. You know, when people think of Native people, think of teepees, horseback riding, bows and arrows, but they fail to see that, you know, even the far remote societies, they evolved. They've learned to adapt and use tools and to use new methods. You know, the Chinoy is ever so evolving that we can't just think of the Native people as, you know, with the buckskin suit and the bandana with the arrow on top. It's no longer that. I mean, it's nice to go back there, but if you're thinking of that, you're stuck in one spot in one time. The true Shnoayeth, what we call the teaching, is to help the person move forward, and move forward in a way that is helpful for that person and also helpful for the community that you're involved in. The true essence of Shnoayeth is that you bring the best values forward to help that person in that time. And it goes hand in hand with modern day teachings. They're slowly catching up. When you talk to children, you talk in an age-appropriate language. You use very big words to describe things. It's going to take a little time, and that's where the true Shnoayeth is lost because we fail to take time that is important for every person, because every person's learning curve or learning personality. Some people will take this amount of time to learn, some people this one, and some people even longer. But regardless of how long you take, you still get there. And that's the traditional way of walking hand in hand, being true. How true are you? You know, they say, you know, the late uncle used to tell us, you wear two hats all the time. One is that you're a student, and one is that you're a teacher. And you see this in very young preschoolers. They learn something, and they're willing to teach their buddy. You know, put this block in here, stand this block over here, come over here, and you play with me. And that's all about, you know, the essence of Mishnah Ayin. That essence, be willing to learn. And as far as I understand it, and this is my own interpretation of Snow Ayat. Snow Ayat is, they say it's teaching, but Snow Ayat is the essence of learning, how I see it. And it's the pureness of that, the pureness of learning, the aha moments, you know, those are wonderful moments. And those aha moments you create for all the younger generation, because we, as right now, we are the old shell, we are the old moment, and as our younger ones grow up, they become the new moment.
The school of the future will be set up to include as much outdoor activity as possible. Elders in our videos talked about the old ways of teaching children and the importance of having parents around to guide them. Our school would be set up so that each class had an academic teacher, an elder, and any parent who would like to be involved in the teachings of the day. The building would be situated on land with a river, stream, or lake nearby. Courses would include both academic and cultural teachings. All of the regular school curriculum, such as math and language arts, social studies and science, will be taught, but cultural teachings, such as language of the territory the school is in, real Canadian history, medicines, and cultural ceremonies, will also play a large role in what is being taught to the children. As in years prior to colonization, the children will be guided in the areas where they have the most interest and gifts. The school structure would have large windows and doors to bring in as much natural light as possible. It would also allow the children to have a view of others throughout the school, so that younger children could feel safe, knowing they could easily find their siblings. The classrooms would look different than typical schools. Instead of desks and chalkboards, there will be benches and floor cushions forming a circle. Whiteboards and computers will be mobile and brought to the classrooms as needed. There will be a comfortable space set up in each room for children who need to take some quiet time, but still be close enough to the rest of the group. There will always be a classroom set up so that food preparation can be taught. This is where children can have their lunches, as well as a place to learn important life skills such as cooking and canning. Children will be taught to fish and hunt. The outbuilding will have areas inside to hang the animals and a freezer to keep them in. The main door will have to be large and also made with glass to try and bring enough light into the building without putting the meat in danger. Canoes will be available for use in order to fish and for general exercise. The back area will be covered and have an area where we can hang the fish. There will be tables and smokers nearby. Each school will have an outside area where they can learn to plant and harvest food and medicinal plants. There is an inner courtyard for school-wide enjoyment. This space would have benches along the sides and can be used for play and or cultural activities.